Thank you very much for joining us today again. This time, we will be starting our discussions on Rand's thoughts on the theory of knowledge. Today's essay is Concept Formation. It appears as a second chapter in Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. Discussing today, we have Don. Don has co-authored books like Equal is Unfair and The Moral Case for Finance. You can follow him in his website, donswriting.com. Before we begin, feel free to make questions on the super chat feature on YouTube. We will be tracking it live. Okay, so let's start. And I was wondering, Don, if we could make a bit of motivation on this essay, which is kind of dry. What if one reads this essay? What is the impact to one's life? How can one's life be changed through reading this essay?
Well, one way to start as an answer is why Ayn Rand decided she's going to write a whole book about concept formation. So this comes from the book Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. And the whole thing is really about her theory of concepts. And her view was that you need to understand the nature of concepts and they need to have a validation in philosophy if you're going to have a defense of reason. So insofar as you think that reason is a useful thing to have in life, then the grounding for that, the ability to say, yes, reason can lead to knowledge, all of that depends on concepts. Because what are concepts? Well, we'll talk about it in more detail as we go along, but just at kind of a broad level, all of the words we use apart from proper names are concepts. Our whole ability to talk about things abstractly, whether it's justice, love, law, friendship, all of the things that make us human are rooted in concepts. And so this is the material of reason. So if you think about something like Newton's laws, it's a certain relationship between abstract concepts. So the whole foundation of all human knowledge is, and I'm stressing human to differentiate it from what we share with animals, which is a perceptual level, the fact that we can see things and hear things and feel things and taste things and smell things. What is distinctively human about our knowledge is all based on concepts. And if you want to put it in personal terms, so you might think, okay, well, that's fine. I'm glad somebody went out and made, a proof of concepts, but why should I have to study it? How is that, I already believe in reason. How is this actually going to improve my life? Well, I'll say this. I have found that almost all of the thinking mistakes that people make are not violating what you find in your usual logic textbook, right? Like it's not like people just engage in some kind of logical fallacy, like they didn't, know modus tollens or something like that. Sometimes it's kind of, fallacies that involve appeal to authority or that involve, just calling people names. But by and large, when people are seriously trying to get at the truth, the kinds of mistakes they make are mistakes in how they use concepts. And so if you've watched these videos for any length of time, you've heard us again and again talk about different package deals. And package deals are invalid concepts. So just as there's an invalid form of argument, Rand is going to argue that there's invalid concepts, and a package deal is invalid because it puts together and treats as identical, as equivalent, things that are essentially different. So just to give one very important example from the objectivist perspective, selfishness, the way that it's conventionally used is a package deal. It groups together creators and criminals. It says that we can treat as essentially similar, and indeed is morally similar, Bernie Madoff and Steve Jobs, Howard Roark and Peter Keating. Why? Well, because they're obviously not out to sacrifice themselves for others. So clearly they're selfish. And that taints then the moral person, the independent creator, the person who's not sacrificing himself to others nor others to himself. And indeed, it obliterates our ability to even formulate a concept of the independent creator. So insofar as you're interested in being a clear thinker, then I think you should be interested in this theory.
Thank you. Very interesting. And I was wondering if you could help us make a map on the kind of answers that have been provided on what a concept is, which is the main issue in this essay. What have historically been the main answers to the questions, or at least what is Ayn Rand's interpretation? Because the same book that we're discussing about has one introduction on Rand's view of what have the answers to what a concept is are. Could you discuss
Yeah,
it?
and I think it's good to start out that way, because one of the things we're going to learn from this is that all knowledge works by differentiation and integration. And indeed, Ayn Rand thinks this is essentially what consciousness is. In fact, I might as well read it because it's one of the most important lines, in my view, in the history of philosophy. This is the first sentence of ITOE, Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. And just as an aside, when I went to work at the Ayn Rand Institute, the first day, the archivist, Jeff Britting, gave us a tour, and he goes, so, this is where we house all the Ayn Rand papers. And he said, what are you interested in philosophy? And I said, well, my main interest is epistemology. And he goes, okay. And he pulls out this box, and I see the first 2 pages of this book handwritten. And the shocking thing is that she wrote this, she said, in a fit of inspiration. And there was almost no changes to it, which is just striking when you read how deep and complicated these ideas are. But in any case, she says, consciousness as a state of awareness is not a passive state, but an active process that consists of 2 essentials, differentiation and integration. So we're going to see how that plays out in her theory. But even to get what her theory is, we want to differentiate it from other attempts to answer this question of what are concepts. And she thinks that broadly these fall into 3 categories. And there's one in particular that we're going to want to talk about because it's really the most plausible. So the first person to give an answer to this issue was Plato. And what he said is, all right, look, we have abstractions and we have particulars and concretes, and they're so enormously different. The particulars are multiple and abstraction is one, and the particulars are material, abstractions are immaterial. And so he thinks that they're so different in so many respects that abstractions must refer to something in another dimension, that there must be these abstract objects that our concepts refer to. If they were to refer to anything real, they can't refer to the things in this reality. What must be going on is that there is we call them sometimes forms. So, the form of man or the form of the good. And what we perceive around us are kind of, you can think of as reflections and of these higher ideals. So, there's, in the world of the forms, there is the perfect triangle. And what we have in this world are triangles that are not exactly perfect. They're kind of like, muddy reflections of this perfect ideal. So this is the kind of realist view. It's that abstractions are real in the same way that this bottle is real. They exist apart from human beings, apart from human knowledge. Then let's go to the far opposite, which is that no, abstractions are unreal. They're arbitrary social conventions that we might, for some reason, find it useful to group things together, but there's no objective basis for it. And you can't say that one person's use of an abstraction is wrong and another person's use is right. That there's nothing that's in reality similar or identical about the things that we group together. And so you can't say that reason has a solid foundation. The most plausible view, which comes from the Aristotelian tradition, says that, look, no, abstractions don't refer to things in another dimension. The only thing that exists are concrete particular objects. But we don't group them together subjectively. That for anything that you look at, so take this book right here. There's a lot about it that's particular, right? Like this has a different cover than my other books, a different number of pages, it's a different size, there's different words in it and things. But there's also a universal essence to it that makes it similar to these other books. And what we're referring to when we refer to book is that universal essence, the thing that is identical between this book and the other books. And so if you think about concept formation, if you think about how we reach concepts from that perspective, what we want to do is we look at the book, right? And we start to strip away its particular characteristics until we can spot, oh, now I've seen it. I've seen the universal characteristic. And Rand thinks that this runs into a basic problem, which is that if you look at an individual particular concrete and you start stripping away its unique characteristics, what are you left with? Well, she thinks it's nothing. That if you're trying to find something identical between this book and all the other books on my bookshelf, you will in the end be left with nothing. Or if you think about particular people, right? If we literally were trying to say what's identical between me and you such that we can group us together under this concept of man, well, there's nothing. Everything is particular and distinct and different. And so this leads to a real problem, which is if there is nothing identical, and if there is no world of forms where these abstractions exist apart from this earth, does that mean the nominalists, as they're called, the people saying that concepts are subjective or arbitrary in some respect, does that mean they're right? And this is her answer to it, where she's going to say, no, everybody's thinking about it in the wrong way. And if we think about concepts in the right way, then we don't need another dimension. We don't strip away everything and end up with nothing that is identical. There is an answer to it, and that's what we're going to talk about in the rest of this discussion.
Thank you very much for that small intro. And I was wondering if we could go right into the essay, or at least right into the book, with that same first chapter that you mentioned. And I think one of the core concepts that she uses is this idea of unit, which is dependent on other two issues. Could you discuss a bit more on the idea of what a unit is and what's its relationship with entities, and why does she think that it's a building block of epistemology?
Sure. So Rand's view, if you're at all familiar with her work, her view is that the first thing that we get, and we get it implicitly, we don't get it as a statement, but the moment we open our eyes as living beings, we get the idea that something exists. And so she thinks that there's an implicit concept, and there's a whole chapter in this book about axiomatic concepts, which we won't go into now. If we have time and people have questions, we can, but there's a lot of complications to it. But her basic point is that the first thing we get implicitly is the concept of existence. There's something. And she thinks the next thing that we get are the kind of basic things that exist, which are entities. That to exist is to be, that the way what we experience what we grasp when we become aware of existence is a world of entities, a world populated by objects, by specific things. And that the next level of awareness is awareness of things, not just that they exist, not just that we're in a world of entities, but of units. And units are seeing entities as members of a group of two or more units. And so I don't just see this when I open my eyes, I see a book. That is, I see this in relationship to all of these other things spread out on the bookshelf, and that in some way it's part of a group. And her view is that things don't exist as units metaphysically. That is, all there is in reality are the entities themselves, but we can view them as standing in a relationship to one another as members of this group. And so the whole endeavor of epistemology, or at least the endeavor of this foundational issue of concept formation, is why can we do that? Why can we see this as a member of a group? What is going on here? And so I mentioned before the kind of Aristotelian view that we look at a single object and strip it away until we get to a universal essence. And what she's doing is rejecting that is at all what we're trying to achieve when we're thinking about concepts. It's that we're not trying to look for a universal in a single particular. It's that we're bringing into relationship a bunch of particulars. And so it's a different kind of perspective. It's that we're not stripping away differences to get to a sameness. It's that we're looking at all of the world in its multiplicity and finding unity in it cognitively, mentally. We're seeing we're grasping a way that is often put is that we're not stripping things away. We're seeing something more. We're seeing the particulars and all of their richness and then grasping something else about them, that they are in a certain way identical to other things that exist. And that's the unit perspective. And that's going to be the core of what is going into Rand's way of thinking about concepts.
Thank you. We have 2 super chats. I think one of them, I'm going to save them for when we have more information. But the other one is from Jonathan in support of Don Watkins.
Thank you, Jonathan.
So I think we can move on to the first part of the essay. And I think that the main question that strikes me is she starts with the definition of a concept. What does she think that a concept is? And what is its relationship to language? And what is the role of words in her view?
Yeah, so let me just read it. So this isn't strictly a definition, or rather you can think about it as kind of an introductory definition. This is something that without going into any particular person's theory, everybody could agree, okay, I know what phenomenon you're talking about. She says a concept is a mental integration of 2 or more units which are isolated according to a specific characteristic and united by a specific definition. And so the kind of starting point is, all right, getting clear on what this phenomenon is. And so I forget exactly how you phrase the question, but what she wants to get us sink our teeth into is, all right, what are we talking about here? And so from one perspective, you might say, like, roughly she's talking about words aside from proper nouns. And she thinks that every word stands for a concept. Now, a concept is not the same thing as a word. And we can get into why it's important that we not confuse words and concepts. I mean, the most obvious one, right, is that we can have the same concept, but what's your native language?
Spanish.
Yeah. So what's Spanish? What's the word book in Spanish?
Libro.
Right. And so we need to have, like, in order to learn another language, you'd have to get, there's this single thing that you and I can share, even if we have a different language that things refer to. You use that word, I use the word book. And then you can learn the language by saying, I'm just substituting a different word for the same concept. So there's important reason to distinguish them. But it's that to have a concept is ultimately to have a word that allows you to retain and refer to these relationships that we're grasping.
Thank you. Could you talk a bit more on what does it mean that the concept ends up being an integration and not a sum of the things that it involves?
I'm trying to think about whether we might want to go to give an overview of the process before we get to that. Yeah, I think so. The easiest way to understand her theory, because there's a lot of moving parts to it, and you can easily get lost in it. And I certainly spent years getting lost in it. And so the way I think about it is that there's 2 issues. There's the conscious process that we go through to grasp a concept, to form a new concept. And then there's the underlying mechanics, or you can think about the implicit process that makes that conscious process actually lead to real knowledge. And so let's start just with the conscious process, because though her real achievement is getting the underlying mechanics of how we do that, the conscious process is easier to grasp, and it helps you figure out how the mechanics fit in. And that basically involves 2 steps of differentiation and integration. So Rand thinks that our first concepts that we form based on perceptual information. There's no inference. We just look out, and what happens is we see things as similar, right? So do I have any other? Yeah. Okay. So like I'm, a kid, and I look out and I see these two books, right? I haven't yet learned to identify them as books, but I see, okay, yeah, there's something similar about them, right? And I'm flipping through them, and they both have words on a page, and they're bound in certain ways, and they're kind of the same size. And my mama sits and reads me stories with them at night. And I see that they're similar, but in order to see them as similar, I have to differentiate them. That is, I have to see them as, if all I do is stare at these in a vacuum, they're just different, right? Like different sizes, different colors, different words in the page. My mom tells me different stories from them. Everything about them, as we've talked about, are different. But what if I bring them into relationship with something else, right? So I'm trying to think of a good example. Well, I mean,
Microphone.
Yeah. Well, a better example would be something like, oh, here we go. Something like this. So this is a notebook, right? It's something that's bound, but you write in it. It's not. It doesn't come pre-printed with words or something like that. And so I'd see what would jump out to me now, if I differentiate these as against that journal, is they now seem similar. That they are less different from each other than they are compared to that notebook. And so now I have a similarity. I have something I can pause on and go, oh, these things are kind of like each other. So that's the differentiation. These two books as against that notebook. But I don't yet have a concept. All I have is a group of two things and maybe a few more that they look similar, but I can't yet do anything with that. I have to form an intention to view these things and other things like them as interchangeable in a certain respect. I have to say, okay, I get that they're particular, but from now on, whenever I encounter anything like that, I'm also going to view them as members of a group. And that's where you get the word. And the word is what it leads to the second step, not differentiation now, but integration. The word completes this process of integration. It says, all right, I am now, whenever I view things like these, I'm going to classify them as books. And what I'm doing now that I'm integrating these objects, these existence into a mental entity, the word, and have this intention to treat them as the same as Ayn Rand says, I'm opening a file folder. And the file folder is where I'm going to put all the knowledge that I gain about them into. So everything I learn about books, so that, they can become damaged if water falls on them, that they can include stories, and they can educate, that, that some of them are rare and expensive, and others are, so cheap that you can't give them away, that, all of that gets put in the file folder. And now whenever I encounter a new book that I've never seen before, I can bring all that knowledge to bear on it. And so I'm not viewing it as a new isolated thing like, oh, what's this? No, I know some stuff about it merely by its inclusion in this category, inclusion in this group. And so that's the human powers. We can study a handful of particulars. If you think about medical knowledge, right? The scientists and doctors who discover it see relatively few people. They examine relatively few people. And yet they can discover knowledge that helps us cure millions, an unlimited number of people. That's what happens when we're able to open these file folders and treat things as identical members of the group, even though they're distinctive, they're particular, they're unique. There's knowledge that applies to all of them that forming this concept unlocks. And so then we can turn to the question of how we do it, which is a more complicated question. But well, let me ask you: do you get the kind of basic process, right? Of we're differentiating by seeing certain things as similar as against what Harry Binswanger has called a foil, and then we're fusing them into a enduring form and a unitary form of awareness that allows us to open a file folder and build a whole library of knowledge about them and apply them to things that we haven't perceived, to books that we may never perceive. We know certain things about books that will exist in the future and that have existed in the past, and that's kind of the core conscious process that we're going through.
Yes, I think I have one small question about that, but maybe I think I will chip it at the end, because I think it has to do a bit on what they refer to reality more than the conscious process. But
yeah, and that's going to be kind of the next step, right? And so, yeah, the question is, what are the mechanics of that process? Like, how does it work? Because notice I said, all right, I perceive them as similar, right? That's when we're differentiating. But when we integrate them, we're going to treat them as, in a certain respect, identical. And you could think, how the hell are you doing that? Like, what justifies that leap? How in the world are you going from these things are kind of alike, but kind of different? In fact, merely less different from each other than from other things. How are you going to that they're identical? And that is the issue, going to be the issue of measurement omission. And Ayn Rand introduces it by talking about not a concept of an entity, even though she thinks these are the first concepts we form. She doesn't think that they're the simplest ones in terms of grasping the process by which we form them. And I think we'll see why in a second, but just to anticipate, an entity is made up of lots of different characteristics, right? And what she thinks is it's helpful to focus on forming a concept of a single characteristic. And so she uses the characteristic of length. And she says, all right, you take, I forget her examples, but it's like a match, a pencil, and I think a ruler, something like that, or a stick. It doesn't matter. And she thinks that what we do is that we see that they share a certain characteristic, length, but in a different measurement, different quantity. And so it's worth reading here because this is the real essence of her theory. She says, let us now examine the process of forming the simplest concept, the concept of a single attribute. Chronologically, this is not the first concept a child would grasp, but it is the simplest one epistemologically. For instance, the concept of length. If a child considers a match, a pencil, and a stick, all right, I was pretty close. He observes that length is the attribute they have in common, but their specific lengths differ. The difference is one of measurement. In order to form the concept length, the child's mind retains the attribute and omits the particular measurements. Or more precisely, it is the process. If the process were identified in words, it would consist of the following. Length must exist in some quantity, but may exist in any quantity. I shall identify as length that attribute of any existent possessing it, which can be quantitatively related to a unit of length without specifying the quantity. And I'm trying to decide if it's worth going into the next one. So there's a lot going on there, but here's kind of the simplest way to think about it. What is it that's different about two books or two people or two tables? So if you think about a table, right? All tables have a flat level surface and support so that we can use it to support, smaller other objects. Well, they might have more or less hardness to them. One table might be more smooth than another table. One table might be darker than another table. Might have or it could be less dark. One table might be heavier than another. One table might have more angles, more sides than another. One table might be longer or shorter than another. One table might have one support, one might have two, one might have three, one might have four. Notice what's striking about all of those differences, all of the differences that distinguish one table from another. They're all quantitative, not in the sense of that we can assign numbers to them, but in the sense of all of the differences involve a more or less. All of the things that make this particular table what it is as against another table is differences of more or less. And that's what she's saying when she's saying that things differ, that the existence you're grouping together differ only quantitatively. Or to put it differently, they're identical in their characteristics, but the characteristics differ in degree, in quantity, in measurement. They differ in terms of more or less. And the same thing then happens if you're going to form a concept of man. How do you and I differ? Well, you and I differ quantitatively. We have the same basic, let's say, man shape, but the kind of contours of that shape and the proportions and the specificity and the color of the skin and the eye, they are going to differ in this more or less way. And so now we can see how we make the leap from these things are similar to that they're identical. They're similar. We're able to perceive them as similar because they share identical characteristics in a range of measurement. But where they are within that range is different. Let me give one more example because I think it's helpful to have a lot of examples on the table, no pun intended, to get this. And so this is if you want to think of colors, and I'm going to oversimplify because actually color is made up of kind of hue and brightness and other elements. But if we just take our kind of common sense idea of color, and let's see, do I have good examples right before me? I'm sure I can do this.
Which color?
Okay. Yeah. So I got you. All right. So I don't know if the lighting makes it clear. This is like a deep red shirt. And then this is, my scissors. Well, if we just look at these two shades of color, they're different, right? But if we compare them to, let's say,
your chair.
What's that? Well, let's make it easier. If we compare it to this folder, and not to the folder itself, but to the color, right? Well, now suddenly these shades of red strike us as, well, they strike us as similar. And why is that? How is it that that we're able to perceive them as similar? Well, it's because they share this characteristic of red that is an issue of more or less. So it's if you think about all the colors, if you've ever played with color on your computer, right, you'll get that bar that shows all the colors kind of bleeding into one another, and that there's a range which you go, oh, this is the red range, and so at one side is going to be pink, and another side it's kind of like your standard red, and then you have the kind of like deep dark red bleeding into purple, I guess it would be. And so what we would say is that any of these particular shades are just different, but they're identical in that they're part of the red range. Whereas blue, that's outside the range. And so even though they have, and so we can treat it as identical. So, you could literally just put bars here and say, all right, everything within here is the same as opposed to things outside the range because it falls somewhere within the red range. And this is why Ayn Rand emphasizes when we're omitting measurements, we're not saying, well, it's red, but no particular shade of red. She goes, no, everything that's red is a particular shade of red. We're not pretending that there can be redness apart from a particular shade. What we're saying is that any shade of red qualifies as a member, qualifies an existent as being a unit of this group. And so it's that sense in which we're omitting measurements. We're saying, yes, measurements exist. They have to exist. Everything is of a particular quantity. But when we're treating them as units, when we're treating them as members of a group, we're saying it can be any quantity within the relevant range.
And how does this answer what you were discussing about Rand's critique to Aristotle's subtraction idea on what you were explaining, how we obtain the concept of a book according to Aristotle?
So and I'm not necessarily going to attribute to Aristotle because I've not studied him in particular, but I understand that some scholars think he's better than traditionally his views have been described, but we can put it as the Aristotelian tradition would hold that what we're doing is stripping away the particular to get to the universal. And what Ayn Rand is doing is saying we see the particular as falling within a range, and that allows us to universalize, if you want to put it that way. So we're retaining the distinctiveness of each shade of red. We're not pretending that there's some universal redness that we can get by like carving away at this color, but we see that all of these shades are identical because they fall within the same range in what she calls a conceptual common denominator. If you want to think, the conceptual common denominator in this case would be what? It would be color. We can relate these reds as against these blues. We couldn't relate these reds. We couldn't differentiate these reds from, the show Cat or the musical Cats. They would just be disparate. There would be no kind of relationship that we could bring them into. But if we have a conceptual common denominator that these things share a characteristic, then that allows us to see them as commensurate, then we can start carving out pieces of that conceptual common denominator and saying, all right, this is the red part of it, this is the blue part of it, this is the green part of it, and so on.
Thank you.
And that's just it's very different from what the here's another way. Let's see if I can recreate it. There's a really good way that Harry Binswanger once put the distinction. It was something like, if we're thinking about the concept number, the kind of Aristotelian view would say number is neither 1 nor 2 nor 3, but something that they have in common. And the objectivist view would be that number is 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and so on. So it's a way of not searching for something that is that lacks particularness, but grasping what particular things share in common.
Thank you. Okay, well, we have a super chat from Bonnie. She says, thank you so much for doing this. And Ella as well, she says, ITO is mind-blowing. I agree. And I think the next question has to do with the next paragraph that you were about to read. And it's to what extent this process is conscious, and to what extent, the example of length, she says that the child does not need to think in those words, but what are the words that he does need to think about? And what is the extent in which this process is conscious, and what part of the process isn't conscious?
Yeah, so at the first level concepts of entities, all you need to do is look and see a similarity and exert a kind of mental focus and resolve, like, oh, cool. Like, all right, in effect, I'll treat these as the same. Oh, red. Oh, red isn't first level, but it's basically, book, man, dog, cat, car. The similarities leap out at you, and so there's nothing to do but kind of notice them, and then if you're in a situation where you're learning language from other people, it's that they're helping you say, okay, this is the word that you use to call things that look like that. When you get to higher level abstractions, and we can say just a quick word about that, what you can do is you can integrate further these first level concepts into higher level abstractions. So it's not just that I form the concept table and chair, I can form the concept furniture. I don't just notice man, cat, dog, I can form the concept animal, which integrates the concepts man, cat, and dog. I can subdivide as well, which is a more abstract process, even if it's getting us to a narrower thing, right? So I don't just have the concept dog, I have the concept chihuahua, I have the concept pug. I don't just have the concept man, I have the concept doctor, philosopher, and so on. And that we can engage in this kind of increasingly abstract process of relating things. And that as you're becoming more abstract, then the process inherently involves the use of words, and inherently involves a more effortful conceptual activity, because similarities don't leap out at you perceptually, they have to be grasped conceptually. Now, the process of measurement omission is not a conscious process, and it's in effect the underlying fact about things, that they stand in more or less relationship to one another, and that is sort of the underlying fact that makes possible that our ability to disregard differences in measurement and see things as identical. But you never have to know that that's what you're doing. You have to learn the skill of differentiating and integrating. And there's a lot epistemology has to say about when you differentiate and when you integrate and when you don't, when you form concepts and when you don't, how you define concepts and how you don't define them. So there's a lot of explicit guidance that we need, but the process of measurement omission itself, that's taking place regardless of a person's aware of it. That's why it's like people were forming concepts long before Ayn Rand came along and explained how they did it. We were omitting measurements, in other words, long before Ayn Rand came along and pointed out that that's what we're doing.
Thank you. And also, you mentioned briefly the CCD, which is the conceptual common denominator. Could you talk a bit more about that? And maybe I have a follow-up to that question. But in essence, you mentioned that it was color, but could you discuss a bit more, for instance, in a table, what would it be, or what is the CCD about in general?
So I mentioned before that in order to think, that the first step in forming a concept is to differentiate, to say these things as against those things. Well, what enables us to differentiate is by seeing that certain things fall along what Rand calls a conceptual common denominator. And let's get how she puts it. A commensurable characteristic, so color, for instance, or length, or shape, is an essential element in the process of concept formation. I shall designate it as the conceptual common denominator and define it as the characteristic or characteristics reducible to a unit of measurement by means of which man differentiates two or more existence from other existence possessing it. So when I form the concept, let's take a more complicated one of man. When I'm forming the concept man, well, that's man doesn't have I'm not isolating a single characteristic. We have lots of characteristics, right? And so at the kind of, but what allows us to distinguish man from animals? Well, I'd say at the most primitive level, what we're doing is you have some concept of like man shape as against animal shape, right? And what does man shape mean? Well, it basically means that we can break man shape down into specific characteristics that can be measured. So it's ultimately, the idea is you could break out a ruler and see, all right, along all of these different axes, like, all right, the head is 2 I was going to say inches. Hopefully your head is bigger than 2.4 inches wide. But the point is that you could measure shape by breaking it down into component parts of length. But that what we're doing then is that in order to differentiate, it has to be that we're seeing, well, there's the kind of underlying similarity between, no, I'm not putting that right. If similarity is a bigger difference swamping a smaller difference, it's that you and me are different, except if we bring in a cat or a dog, and then it's our differences are swamped by this bigger difference. I said it's that we're seeing that our differences are a smaller part of a larger range, right? We're in the man-shaped part of the shape range, where now if we think about the animal shape range, that's kind of a wider part of it. And then if you think about going to abstractions, part of what we're doing is that man shape was the distinguishing characteristic that a child has. It distinguishes us from the shapes of other animals. But what about when we form the concept of animal? Well, now if you think about it, to put it in the simplest terms, we've expanded now the range, and we've said, okay, man shape, dog shape, cat shape, these are actually within a similar range as against the range of flower shape, tree shape. We're expanding this commensurable range, the same characteristic, and the distinguishing characteristic now was the old CCD. The old CCD was animal shape, and then the distinguishing characteristic was man shape. And when we get to form the concept animal, it's what had been the CCD becomes the DC, becomes the distinguishing characteristic. And so there's a lot of complexity to how this gets cashed out. But the basic point is this. What Rand is trying to do here is explain how things that are not obviously measurable are measurable. So if she's saying that what allows us to form the concept length is that all of these things possess length, well, what do you do when they possess a whole bunch of different characteristics? It's that they're all ultimately reducible to the same kinds of measurements.
My follow-up has to do with that last point. I think it's very common, at least in my knowledge of the history of philosophy, that philosophers often treat definitions or the way that people define concepts as intensive, in the sense of man equals rational animal and nothing more. But I think saying that the CCD, that the identification of a CCD is a way in which it defies that kind of view, because when you form a concept, there will be so much information contained within that concept just because of the CCD, and not even from the distinguishing characteristic, that seeing a definition as something intensive is simply senseless.
Yeah, I don't think about it exactly in those terms, though I agree with what you're saying, that in effect, the kind of conventional view is that what a concept is basically its distinguishing characteristic. Or sometimes it'll be thought of in more expansive terms of its definition. So it's this, genus plus this differentia. It's rationality plus animality. And if you get that, what is going on is that you're actually looking out at the world and grouping together existence, then inherent in that process is a lot of knowledge about things that are not specified in either the genus or the differentia. That there's a whole bunch going on about you that is not animality plus rationality. And that if you equate a concept in its definition, you're emptying it of all the richness. Again, the whole uniqueness of, not the whole, part of the power of Rand's view of concepts is that people will often talk about what we do when we're getting abstract is we kind of zoom out and we get a what's the word that they'll use? In effect, it's kind of like you zoom out and everything becomes blurrier. So we're dropping out certain information so that we can grasp more abstract facts about things. And Rand thinks, no, we're not dropping out anything, that you're not losing information when you go to an abstract level. It's that you're grasping more. You're grasping not just the uniqueness and individuality of things. You're also grasping relationships among those things. And as you become more and more abstract in your thinking, you're grasping more and more relationships. But they're relationships among entities, including all of their particular characteristics, including characteristics that you don't yet know. And that is it. If you keep in mind that that's what you're doing, then the idea that human beings are just rationality plus animality is literally inconceivable. It's dumping out the whole reason that we're trying to form concepts and the whole way that we do form concepts.
Thank you. So I wanted to move to what I call the clarifications part of the essay. I don't know if you wanted to discuss something more about the process before we move to that part of the essay.
No, I mean, what I will say is because it is one of the most difficult points in objectivism. So I have a video series called what is it called? Commentaries on OPAR. If you go to youtube.com/Don Watkins Live, and there's a few videos where I go through this in great detail. Harry Binswanger's given some incredibly valuable courses that are on Ayn Rand, the Ayn Rand Institute's YouTube channel, and Greg Salmieri has a course that's an introduction, or it's objectivist epistemology and outline. And so I'd say for like a really in-depth take on these, beyond, of course, reading Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology and Leonard Peikoff's treatment, those are really powerful. And I mentioned Harry's course, but he also has a book, How We Know, which I think is the best kind of treatment for people really like trying to get a handle on what's being argued in this. So this shouldn't be taken as kind of like we've given the last word, but hopefully that gives people kind of a way into the topic, because it does take several hours of a formal lecture to really get the kind of full meaning of this process.
Okay, thank you. So one of the questions that I came up with when I reread the essay is why does Ms. Rand talk about the issue of adverbs, adjectives, conjunctions, any kind of word that exists? Why does she think that she must justify that those kind of concepts can be made, and that they obey the same process of concept formation?
Well, I would say there's two kind of interrelated things going on there, and you can put it, clarification and justification. So if you think she's given her account of how we form concepts, and you might think, well, what's the proof? And really the proof is to look at to range across the different concepts that we form and think, does this process explain how we do it? And so you need to look at, okay, well, we have first level concepts, but does that process really apply to higher level concepts and more abstract concepts? What about to what she calls concepts of consciousness? Okay, you're talking about measurement, and that might make sense if we're talking about material physical entities, but can you measure love? And so she's going to take on head on how measurement would apply to concepts like love, and fairness, and law, like all of these concepts that involve, at least in part, if not in whole, aspects of consciousness. How are they measurable? Then she's going to look at, well, what about concepts where they seem to apply to everything that exists and don't seem to be formed through differentiation and integration. And that's axiomatic concepts. But then it's okay, if we're going to range across all of our concepts, you would want to go through then all of the, in effect, categories of concepts that we have, which, I mean, that's what grammar identifies. And so she goes through adjectives, adverbs, so on. And it's both to explain, this is how my theory accounts for it, so that that's clear, but also so that that's the justification. Now, I don't think it follows that, like, if you found kind of a weird, unusual case that didn't involve measurement omission, you throw out the whole theory. I don't think that's what's involved, but you have to get, no, this theory can account for at least, the vast majority of concepts that we're forming, and here's how it applies. So I think of this is kind of the, all right, I've painted my theory, and now I'm going to show that, yes, this actually solves the problem, answers the question of how we come to have concepts, and explains why these different kinds of concepts are legitimate, are rational.
Thank you. And the other issue, it's about math, her identification that there are important correlations between math and epistemology. Could you talk a bit more about specifically the two that she mentions here, but she also mentions one in the first chapter, if you would like to go through that. But why do you think that identifying the relationship is relevant, and basically what is the relationship that she says there is?
Well, so her view is that mathematics is the science of measurement. And so one of the things that is true is that well, let me read what she says, because the basic point I take her to be making is not simply that there's this interesting parallel and that it's the same process, but that if you grasp that it's a mathematical process, suddenly I think the idea is that all of the objections, the idea that there's something subjective or suspicious about us grouping things together, vanish when you see that it's the same thing that we do in mathematics. And so this is how she puts it. Two links between the conceptual and the mathematical fields are worth noting at this point, apart from the obvious fact that the concept unit is the base and start of both. One, a concept is not formed by observing every concrete subsumed under it and does not specify the number of such concretes. A concept is like an arithmetical sequence of specifically defined units going off in both directions, open at both ends, and including all units of that particular kind. For instance, the concept man includes all men who live at present, who have ever lived, or will ever live. An arithmetical sequence extends into infinity without implying that infinity actually exists. Such extension means only that whatever number of units does exist it is to be included in the same sequence. The same principle applies to concepts. The concept man does not and need not specify what number of men will ultimately have existed. It specifies only the characteristics of man and means that any number of entities possessing these characteristics is to be identified as men. And then two, and this is, I think, the more revealing one for our purposes. The basic principle of concept formation, which states that the omitted measurements must exist in some quantity, but may exist in any quantity, is the equivalent of the basic principle of algebra, which states that algebraic symbols must be given some numerical value, but may be given any numerical value. In this sense and respect, perceptual awareness is the arithmetic, but conceptual awareness is the algebra of cognition. The relationship of concepts to their constituent particulars is the same as the relationship of algebraic symbols to numbers. In the equation 2a equals a plus a, any number may be substituted for the symbol a without affecting the truth of the equation. For instance, 2 times 5 equals 5 plus 5, or 2x, or 2 times 5 million equals 5 million plus 5 million. In the same manner, by the same psychoepistemological method, a concept is used as an algebraic symbol that stands for any of the arithmetic sequence of units it subsumes. Let those who attempt to invalidate concepts by declaring that they cannot find manness in men try to invalidate algebra by declaring that they cannot find anus in 5 or 5 million. So I mentioned before that the whole objection to concepts is saying that, look, there's nothing identical about them. And here with math, what we're seeing is that, yeah, there is something identical about 5 or 5 million in this equation. That it's that the relationship is the same, even if the quantity is different. So, it's when we have 2 times 5 equals 5 plus 5, I'm sorry. Yeah. 2a equals a plus a. What that is saying is that relationship, we can retain that relationship while recognizing that there can be infinitely different quantities that fulfill that relationship, that stand into that same relationship to one another. And so it's this idea that you can have a relationship with different quantities that is true in mathematics, and that is true then when we're talking about non-mathematical existence that we're classifying and that we're viewing as units.
Thank you. I don't know if well, let's bring it on. Like, my understanding is that Ms. Rand was thinking about knowing a lot more about mathematics because she thought that there was more relationships between math and epistemology. Do you know a bit more on if there have been works on that? And do you think it would be that the contributions would have to come from the philosophy of science, or I think it would be more reinforcing to concept formation?
Yeah, I plead ignorance there. Certainly, there have been a number of objectivists who've done work on the philosophy of mathematics itself. And I know Pat Corvini years ago was working on some stuff, and Harry Binswanger is currently doing a lot of thinking about the philosophy of math. And I'm going blank in his first. Well, I'm going blank in his first name, but Knapp, forgive me, sir, did some really interesting work there. And it's just not something I followed. In part, I'm incredibly uneducated in math. But certainly Rand believed that there were parallels to be drawn. But what those parallels are, I am going to be I am currently the last one to know.
Okay, thank you. And finally, I think the conclusion of talking about the essay should be, what is the achievement in this like 4-page essay? What is it revolutionary? And then maybe, or what is revolutionary, and then what is finally the answer to what concepts are referring to in reality? Maybe that's an interrelated question, but I just want to pitch them.
Yeah, well, if you want to underline it, it's that concepts are referring to existence with their measurements omitted, saying that these things are the same attributes, different measurements within a given range of measurements. And so it's the part I've tried to keep coming back to and emphasize is the idea it's that we can treat things as identical that are different because they're identical in falling within the same range of measurements, and that their differences are only of more and less than of the same characteristics. And so that is the real key to it, is that being able to grasp sameness in a universe where nothing is identical in its particularness. And that's what then is going to allow us to treat things as similar and therefore apply to whole groups of things knowledge gained by only a few of them. And I mean, that is the revolution, of course, is not that we can do that. We've been able to do that since as long as we've been human. But the real revolution is that for the first time, we understand fully how we do that, and therefore can have better guidance on how to do it. And therefore, and also to defend the action of an activity of doing that from those who want to say that it's invalid. Because what does it mean to say it's invalid? Well, in the end, what it is that there's people who want to say, well, I want to be able to claim that I have the truth. I want to be able to impose my ideas on others, and I don't want to have to prove them. I don't want to have to account for them. I don't want to be subservient to reason. I don't want to have to answer to reason, and therefore I'm going to attack and overthrow it. And with this as a foundation, then that's kind of the basic issue that has to be defended in order to tell those people, and in fact, like, screw you. No, this is a faculty that works, that puts us in touch with reality, and therefore we need to honor that faculty and use it if we're going to be able to claim rightfully that we've achieved knowledge.
Thank you. One of the questions that I had at the beginning is if I was correct identifying that historically concept had been treated either as names, that is the nominalist view, which basically it's naming just man-made groupings, or tags made out of reality, which is more like the realist view. But I mean, I'm not sure if that's the right way to see that, but would it be the right way to see that objectivism says that concepts are more identifications based on measurement omissions? Do you think that would be correct to say, or precise at least to say that, against the other ones?
I think so. I mean, it's certainly, the view is that so one of the cashing out of this theory of concepts is the whole objectivist view of objectivity. And it's a really profound concept of objectivity, because what it does is say, in effect, that what we're doing when we form concepts, and what we're doing more broadly when we're being objective, is we're taking a human approach to things. Concepts they don't exist in the world. Things are not units absent human beings. They're just entities in existence. And that it's only a human perspective that then brings things into relationship and sees them as members of a group. So it's a human perspective on the world, but that it's not arbitrary, it's not subjective, that it's a perspective based on facts. That is, things really do stand in a relationship to one another of differing and only more or less kind of relationships. Like, that's a fact about them. And it's that fact that we're grasping when we view them as units. And so it's that's sort of what you want to capture that's unique about objectivism, is that it's a human way of looking at the world based on facts. I'm changing the context in which I think this was originally formulated, but I think it was Harry Binswanger who had said at one point that, there's kind of two views. You have a Thanksgiving Day turkey, and one view is that it's completely arbitrary when you cut where you cut it. You can just cut wherever you want. And then another view that in effect would say, well, if it weren't to be arbitrary, nature would have to draw dotted lines of cut exactly here, and anywhere else to cut is the wrong way. And objectivity is recognizing that no, there's choice involved. Like, you can cut in this place or that place, but that there's better and worse places to cut. There's certain facts about the turkey that make it wrong to cut it, just like what would it be, widthwise versus lengthwise, and so on. And that's kind of the perspective that one should have on what concepts are.
Okay, thank you. I was saving this super chat from Enric from a while ago, and I think it's a bit related to the nature of concepts. And he asks, couldn't for animals and plants the genes be their unique essence that makes human different from a cat, from a tree?
Well, this is sort of changing. There's kind of two things going on there. So on one side of it, or one potential thing that could be going on here, is confusing metaphysically what explains the nature of a human being is the nature versus the nature of a plant versus the nature of an animal. And you could say, well, the cause is different genes. But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about forming a concept. What we're talking about is not sort of like, what was the, evolutionary trajectory such that there became animals and plants and so on. We're saying, what is the fact or facts about something that distinguishes it from other similar things? And, but if you ask that question, there is a respect in which genes, could theoretically be a kind of answer, which is that we talked about how in forming the concept of man, the sort of characteristic that would jump out as a child might be the characteristic of shape, and that there'd be man shape versus other kinds of animals. So you'd have the kind of CCD of animal shape, and then man shape would be one kind of subset within that larger sphere. But of course, as adults, the category of measurements that we would see as distinguishing of human beings are not shape. right? That's not, if we don't define man in terms of man shape, we define it in terms of range of consciousness. That's the CCD along which we distinguish human beings as adults from other animals and other organisms. And so, in the point being that as you grow in your knowledge, the categories that of measurement that you're looking to in order to distinguish this thing and that is going to shift and evolve. And then there can be specialized areas that are relevant for specialists. So, for instance, if you are a scientist who is trying to understand biology, that you might think that the fundamental issue is a certain kind of genetic sequence, right? And the genetic sequence for man is this kind of this range of measurement versus of other great apes versus of other mammals and so on. You might think in terms of like genetic code. I'm not that knowledgeable about biology, so I can't say, I'm going to use words that will make me sound very inept, but hopefully the major point will come away. But however biologists would define man, that doesn't overtake how everybody going about their lives who needs to have a definition of man that is allowing them to isolate and open a file folder and retain knowledge and apply knowledge about man needs. They're just grasping the fact, so we're the rational animal. That's sufficient and proper, even if it's also proper for a specialist to have a different definition for his or her field, which may be genetic. So hopefully that answers it.
Thank you. And I have one last question, unless a super chat comes up. And this is kind of related to the view of how we form concepts, and is related also to color. I think I've heard many times that the Greeks didn't have the concept blue as such. And it's not because they didn't see blue, but rather that the way that they choose to categorize colors began in other set of colors that didn't match, that in which blue was not included. For instance, they used red and yellow, and so how does that fit within objectivism? Would that be a claim against, or would it be a claim for objectivism view of concepts?
Well, to answer that, you have to understand how objectivism deals with what it calls borderline cases, which is that for certain concepts, there's a certain optionality, or for certain concepts or for certain concretes, there's a certain optionality in how you classify things. So an example, we'll come back to color. An example that gets talked about in workshops that Ayn Rand gave following the publication of the book is, okay, we define a table as it's a flat level surface with supports that is used to support smaller objects. And somebody asked, well, what if I created a hanging table? So it's, a chain that holds something down. And Rand's view was that's a borderline case, and there's a certain optionality. And you could, on the one hand, just treat it as kind of a subcategory of table. So it's just as you have coffee table, you have hanging table, or something like that. You could use a descriptive phrase, and like, this doesn't even need to be conceptualized because it's just some weird thing sold at some weird store that nobody uses. So we don't even need a concept for it. We just go, hey, that's a table that hangs from a chain. And I'm missing one other category, but the basic idea is that because because concepts are a human way of looking at things for human purposes, there's not necessarily, to go to the carving of the turkey example, right? The fact that there's a certain amount of optionality doesn't make it arbitrary. That we it indeed restricts and restrains our optionality. And the point is that not everything is optional. So we have to classify under the concept table like a coffee table. And you couldn't just call it a dog or something like that. And so it's one of the powers of the objectivist theory is precisely that it can deal with borderline cases. And so I think the same thing applies to color. Like, remember, color, it's in effect, if you stretch it out in enough detail, it's sort of like the old saw about, like, at what point does a hair become a beard? And that's supposed to be some kind of clever riddle. But the point is that there's points at which you can say a person definitely has a beard and points at which a person definitely doesn't. And then there's kind of this range in the middle of becoming a beard that we can draw a line anywhere within that range. And it's the same with color. It's that there's definitely a difference between these two things. But at what point do we draw the line between this and this, and I don't have like the next shade lighter? Where exactly do we draw the line and say, okay, now we've left the red and moved into a different color? There's a certain optionality to that, and that's fine. Like, notice that we're perfectly able to deal with it precisely through things like descriptive phrases. And the Greeks, I'm sure, were too. I don't know exactly what they did call blue, but presumably they had a way to distinguish it from. I mean, we could do the same thing today. Like, if we really wanted to screw with future generations, you could do it the opposite way, which is, instead of, well, I mean, here's a good example. Pink. This pink could have easily just been light red and not gotten its own concept. But we made the decision that, no, this is distinctive enough and useful enough that we want to isolate it. But that's an issue of optionality. And if, another civilization comes along in 2,000 years and they're like, what the hell is this pink that they're all focused on and all about? And somebody says, oh, they had a whole word for light red. It's kind of the inverse of what the Greeks are doing. And it doesn't become like, oh my God, like they see color differently or something like that.
Thank you. And it would be an issue, right, with both nominalists and specifically the realist view of
certainly
concepts.
For the realist view, right? Because their whole view is reality has to give us dotted lines. Like, there better really well be a form of the pink up there if we're going to have the concept pink. And what the hell do we do if there's not a form of the pink and there's only a form of the red and the light? And I mean, I don't know Plato well enough to how he would account for things like this. But you can see how it becomes a problem if you think, like, all right, I'm saying that concepts have to exist in reality and there seems to be an optionality. So for Plato or the Aristotelian tradition, it is a real problem, right? If there's choice involved. But from the objectivist perspective, the whole thing is an issue of choice. It's human choice that I'm going to look at things this way and resolve to treat things in a similar way or in an identical way. That is the whole starting point of the process. Choice is part of it through and through and through. And the objectivist innovation and really the transformative insight is to get that, even though it involves choice through and through, it is not arbitrary, is not subjective. And I think that's the hardest point to get in objectivism, to really get this idea of choice without subjectivity.
Thank you. So I think for me that's everything. I don't know if you don't want to say something else that we didn't cover.
Well, I mean, I gave my recommendations, which I'll just reiterate, which is that this can feel really confusing, but I encourage people, it really does pay dividends. And I named some resources that I certainly found incredibly helpful. I'll underline again Harry Binswanger's How We Know, though there's free resources available online. But it's one of the it really pays dividends to study and then certainly to return to Ayn Rand herself, precisely because all of thinking ultimately involves the ability to know how to form and use concepts. And that's one of the things that you'll find is that almost nobody else talks about that. And certainly nobody, I think, elevates it in importance as objectivists do and have so much insight in the right way to form and use concepts that objectivists have. Like you'll find elements of it in other places, but it's rare and not as robust and fruitful and deep as the objectivist perspective. And so it's worth putting the time into. It's worth revisiting from time to time. And though it is very difficult to talk about off the cuff in an interview, hopefully this gave you some sense and orientation to go explore more and some incentive to explore more.
Thank you. And I thank you personally for those series that you did on OPAR. Thank you very much. They've been very helpful. With that being said, I thank all the audience for hearing this today. It's been an amazing talk again. Today there's no flirting with reason, sadly. Hopefully they'll be back soon. But tomorrow there's a communication bootcamp. You are still not too late to join us to learn communication things with us. You just have to become a member, £10 a month minimum. Consider to join. I think the link is on the description below. Thank you very much.